This is Miller Philosopher. Denethor's relationship with his sons is one of the most infamous and tragic threads in Lord of the Rings, whether it's the books or the movies. Everyone knows the deference that he showed towards Boromir and the suspicion, or outright contempt, that he reserved for Faramir, depending on which version of the man you decide to go with. But the real question for me is, why did Boromir shine so brightly in his father's eyes, while Faramir, who was equally capable, if more subtle, was treated like as if he was a disappointment? Book fans know Denethor's history. A rising steward-to-be of Gondor that found itself in yet another war with the Corsairs of Umbar, and indirectly found himself personally in competition with Thorongil, aka Aragorn, the war's soon-to-be celebrated hero, and that rivalry had shaped him. Thorongil, at the end of the campaign, had led a daring night raid that burned most of the Corsair fleet. And, in my own headcanon, I would assume that Denethor would have been there as well, just as his son would serve in Gondor's military later on. Therefore, why didn't Denethor, heir of the steward, then lead the attack himself if this was true? Well, the appendices hint that people saw him and Thorongil as rivals, both men being similar in age, intelligence, and appearance, though Thorongil had the charisma of Gondor's lost kings, from an era that had long since passed. And it's easy to imagine Denethor kind of bristling at this foreign upstart stealing his thunder, his people's love, even his father's admiration. And I would assume that therefore he would seek to basically prevent this from happening by participating in the war and at least especially this particular raid. However, Thorongil became the hero anyway, only sparing Denethor's pride by vanishing into the shadows, refusing the reward and tribute that awaited him in Minas Tirith. Denethor, being as shrewd as ever, likely guessed Thorongil's true identity of that being Aragorn, the last of the kings of either kingdoms, based on the situation of the Dunedain in both places. And just as Boromir later saw Aragorn as a threat to Gondor's traditions later on, Denethor would have felt the same way, I think, at that age, masking his insecurity with pride, since this was the man who basically had more or less stolen everything from him, I guess you could say. The love of his father, the glory of the war, and even the love of his people. And all of this despite being the fact that he was the next person in line to be the High Steward of Gondor, while Thorongil was just an outsider whom, as far as everyone else knew, at best was from an allied kingdom of Rohan. Enter Boromir. Boromir was everything Denethor wanted to be, and that's why I think that he doted on him so much. Thorongil was strong, handsome, charismatic, and of Númenórean blood. And Boromir seemed to contain all these traits as well. And, while not as cunning as Denethor, he was kingly enough to inspire loyalty, the same type of loyalty that his rival had inspired ages ago. A loyalty that was worthy enough for the future High Steward of Gondor, or, if traditions had allowed it, the next king of Gondor even. Boromir embodied the man that Denethor wished he could have been when he was younger, and because Boromir was of his own blood, the sting of that inadequacy was softened more or less. Essentially, Denethor was living through his eldest son, I guess you could say, and praising Boromir was a way of reclaiming what Thorongil had stolen decades ago. That being said, what does this say about Faramir then? Well, Faramir was different. Again, people deep in the lore and in the books know that when Finduilas, Denethor's wife, had died, Denethor saw her in Faramir. And, worst off, he saw that Faramir was becoming basically a wizard's pupil by befriending Mithrandir, which was pouring more salt on the wound, as basically highlighting, in a way, his failure as a father and as a steward of Gondor. But I think it was more than that. I think Faramir essentially reminded Denethor of himself. But when I say himself, I don't mean the man as he wanted to be, but the man as he actually was during the time of the Corsair War. Intelligent and noble, but lacking that bold charisma to seize the spotlight. To Denethor, if Boromir was a reflection of the man that Denethor had wanted to be at that age, Faramir was a mirror of his own failures, of the person he actually was. A reminder of the flaws that had cost him his father's love, the people's admiration, and the glory of the war, and, in effect, his own pride. In conclusion, Denethor's sons embodied the two halves of Denethor's insecurity, of the man himself. Boromir being the man he always wanted to be, and Faramir the man he actually was. And it's not hard to imagine that Sauron would have loved twisting this around in his head through the Palantir, preying and feeding on Denethor's despair of not only Gondor's weakened state, but that it was his fault because of his own failings that were present back during the war, and that were highlighted by the success of a mysterious stranger that basically no one knew anything about except himself. So, therefore, later on during the War of the Ring, when Gandalf arrives in Gondor's twilight, offering hope in one hand and supplanting him with the King of Gondor in the other, that more or less was the last straw for Denethor. Because this wasn't just some sort of unknown heir that Mithrandir pulled out of his ass somewhere. This was the same man, the very man who had humiliated him decades ago, stolen his father's love, and had stolen the love of his people. And now Mithrandir was saying that his guy was now actually coming back, no longer hiding in the shadows, but coming back into the court, into Gondor, in its time of worst need, to therefore take the throne. And that would have been the cap of Denethor's failure, not just as the High Steward of Gondor, but as a man himself. And to be fair to Denethor, he wasn't wrong about one thing. Gandalf's subtlety sucked. That being said though, if Gandalf had truly understood the weight of Denethor's past, the effect that it had on him, the effect that Aragorn / Thorongil had on Denethor, even though it wasn't his intention, would Mithrandir's counsels have landed differently? Would he have handled it with more subtlety? Or would he have just been the same blunt person as he always is? Who's to say? In the next video, I will explore what would have happened had Aragorn re-met with Denethor if Denethor had somehow survived the War of the Ring. But regarding this video, let me know your own thoughts below if you have any, or if you just enjoyed it. I'm glad. This is the Middle-earth Philosopher. Have a good day.